No one liked going to that house. We knew it belonged to the family and that occasionally someone used it out of sheer emergency, simply when there was no other option, when there was nowhere else to spend the night. Even so, few dared to spend an entire night there. As far as I know, only my Uncle Lalo spent a whole night alone in that place, and he never wanted to do it again. This is particularly important to mention because my Uncle Lalo was a soldier and was never afraid to face anything. I remember once he went out to defend some cousins from a gang that came chasing them to the house. My uncle put down his beer, grabbed a tire iron, and with it in his hand, went out to confront them. He didn't have to say anything. They knew him well enough to know that even though they were four, they wouldn't come out unscathed. So imagine a man like that, someone who faces everything without fear, being scared like a child every time someone even mentioned the House of the Widows. It was called that because that enormous mansion was once the refuge of every woman in the family who, almost as if obeying a curse, became widowed in the prime of her youth. I am not a believer in the paranormal. Well, I wasn't. I never had been. So I attributed the stories told about that house to collective suggestion, an almost contagious will to believe, which could indeed make people feel strange things when someone visited it. I also thought it could be due to all the sadness that inhabited the house. Aunt Valentina, the first widow, used that house almost like a convent to receive distant or close relatives who decided to live in permanent mourning and dedicate their lives to God. They rarely went out and were not allowed to make friends outside the house. As I said, it was practically a convent with fewer permissions and more discipline. And you might ask yourselves, who on earth would accept living in a place like that under those rules? Well, that's a good question. Aunt Valentina had a lot of money. I mean, more money than could be spent in several lifetimes. But she never used it for anything other than the maintenance of that house and its inhabitants. This included paying each of them a monthly allowance that was enough to support themselves, and in some cases, to support the children who had been left outside. We're talking about many decades ago when women in places like this didn't know how to work, and upon becoming widows, felt that their world had ended. But beyond giving you this context, which I think is important, allow me to tell you about the time I spent a night in that house, the reason why I delve into this story, the one about the House of the Widows, the one about my family. Currently, the house has been uninhabited since Aunt Valentina died in 1984, 40 years ago. Due to provisions in her will, the house cannot be sold until 50 years after her death, and the money that was left has been used for its maintenance. My aunt's eccentricities, but that's how it's stipulated. But as I was saying, it has served as a meeting point, as a place to spend the night only in cases of extreme urgency. I never quite understood why no one had moved into it. I thought it was more due to family quarrels, because it belonged to everyone and to no one, than due to the genuine fear that the house provoked. When my cousins and I ended up attending the same high school, something that had never happened before, Aunt Valentina's house, the House of the Widows, became our favorite place to spend the afternoons. It was less than a kilometer from the school, so it was common to go there to do homework, and I must admit, also to throw a party when we decided to skip a class, hiding there. In the House of the Widows, I had my first beer, got drunk for the first time, vomited from being drunk for the first time, but always in the afternoon, before it got dark. It was on one of those afternoons when my cousin Viridiana, my cousin Mariano, and I stayed talking later than usual, until it got dark. It was the first time we spoke directly about the curiosity that the whole family's fear of that house provoked in us. Viridiana told us it was because it was full of ghosts, that the widows never left, that their oath to spend the rest of their lives in the house didn't only refer to their earthly physical life, that their spirits would inhabit it until there was nothing left of the house. When she told us that stupidly, it made me laugh that my cousin believed in something like that. I laughed out loud. That was something I'd expect from my mom, from my aunts, from Catholic ladies who believed in God and spirits and so on. But us? Someone like her, young, an atheist, with a scientific perspective on everything. Mariano didn't laugh but told her not to try to scare us, that we'd spent the last few months in that house without any problem, and that if she wanted us to come less so she could be alone with her boyfriend, then she should just let us know when she'd be there so we wouldn't bother her. Viridiana was more bothered by what Mariano said than by my laughter and mockery, and she said that she didn't need to go there to be with her boyfriend. Well, if you don't believe me, if you're really sure that it's all just stories, it's fine. Let's stay here tonight, there's no school tomorrow. Let's find out for ourselves that nothing happens, that no one else stays in this house because they're silly, gullible. Surely that's why my Uncle Lalo doesn't come anymore, because he's scared. At that moment, we had no choice but to accept the challenge because, although it scared us, a fear we didn't understand, we couldn't back down anymore. We had made our point of view and our disdain for that old family tradition of living, terrified of the House of the Widows, very clear. We called to ask for the necessary permissions, obviously without telling our parents where we would spend the night. We said we'd be together, yes, and that was the only truth we told. We went to one of those convenience stores that are everywhere and all the same to buy snacks, junk food to dine, and of course I bought myself a beer. I had to take advantage. We returned to the house. It has a very large, very heavy gate that practically isolates any sound that could come in or out. No noises from the street reach inside, and very likely, if something happened, no one would hear us scream. I thought about that as I closed it with difficulty, and I closed it. Finally, I closed it. Has it ever happened to you that you do something, the simplest action, and realize that you're about to change your life? Because that's how I felt when I closed it. It was immediate regret, an enormous desire to back out, to seem like a coward. And what did it matter? They were my cousins. They wouldn't judge me. Nothing would happen. I'd admit that it scared me a lot and that I preferred to leave. "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea. What if we leave?" said Mariano, who was evidently thinking the same as I was. I was about to agree when Viridiana burst into laughter. "I knew you were scared, but I really didn't think you'd last so little. Go if you want, but the two of us are going to stay tonight. We're going to find out once and for all if the ghosts of the widows are still here, right?" she said, turning to me. I hoped Mariano would hold out, admit it, and we'd all leave. I think he realized my bluff, that I was trying to blame him, because with eyes that didn't hide his anger, he replied that no, he was going to stay, that we were going to stay, that we'd spend the night in that house, that it was a good night to see a ghost. I didn't know how true that statement would be. We settled in the living room. We'd sleep there. The rooms on the second floor were even darker, more eerie. Besides, this way we could get up to go to the bathroom without separating too much. Very well, who knows a story about one of the widows? Because surely we've all heard some, especially those closer to our families, asked Viridiana. I dared to tell the story I knew, the only one I knew at that moment, the story of Marta, who came to that house around 1970, and if I'm not mistaken, she was a cousin of my grandmother Francisca. You have heard of the famous love spells, right? Marta's story revolves around one of these, because she was deeply in love with Ferran, a young man from the town who was desired by almost all the girls his age. At some point, Ferran went out with Marta. For days, they went for walks together. They met in the park, held hands. Ferran told her about all the towns he had visited, all the cities he had known, all the people from whom he had learned. And beyond being handsome, they say that it was his conversation that made people fall in love, that he was very intelligent, knew a lot about many things, and always said it in a way that didn't seem pretentious but rather aimed to enrich other people's conversations. That's why, although he might seem like a know-it-all, when people understood the intention behind his words, they couldn't help but fall under his charm. Marta greatly enjoyed those weeks, but one day, after having kissed the night before, Ferran appeared in the park walking hand in hand with another girl, a very beautiful one whom Marta had always secretly envied. No, she couldn't compete with her, but Marta knew of a woman who lived on the outskirts of town who charged a few pesos for making love spells and doing witchcraft. Willing to do anything to get Ferran back, and above all to defeat her rival this time, she went to her, paid the fee, followed the rituals to the letter, and one night at the entrance of the cemetery, she met with this woman as they had agreed. They gave her an envelope with herbs and told her to give it to Farhan in a tea. The healer told her that she had to find a way to make him drink it. She couldn't do more on her part. She did warn her, though, that love spells are to preserve love, even the little that remains, but they are very dangerous, deadly, if there was never a true feeling before. Marta was sure that those afternoon talks in the park, that hand holding hers, that kiss, meant that at some point there was love. There had to be a feeling, and she decided to take the risk. Somehow she achieved her goal. She managed to sneak into Farhan's house, taking advantage of his mother's goodwill. She asked her to let her prepare something for her son, who was still working in the workshop, a full dinner, including the tea. Then she pretended she had to leave due to a severe stomachache, leaving the dinner ready for the mother to take to him. Farhan ended up eating it, ended up drinking the tea. The next day, he was at her door looking for her. He asked her to be his girlfriend. He told her that he loved her, that he had never realized it, but that he did, that he had always loved her in silence. The courtship lasted little. After 2 months, they got married, and Marta was the happiest and proudest woman in the world. But something had changed in Farhan. It became increasingly difficult for him to organize his thoughts, as if he were permanently confused. Then he began to say silly, inappropriate comments, began to slur his words to confuse them. His gaze became lost and he couldn't return to work in his workshop. Then he stopped speaking. Marta began to work to take care of Farhan. They moved back in with his mother, who attended to him 24 hours a day. Farhan suddenly couldn't even get up anymore. It was as if he had forgotten how to walk, as if he had forgotten how to eat. One night, coming home from work, Marta arrived ready to hug her husband, as she felt guilty. All day she had been thinking about how she wished that Farhan were dead, that he would go to rest, that he would let her and his own mother rest. But then she realized how monstrous that thought was and stopped to buy her husband's favorite bread. She would find a way to make him eat it. She had to work. She had to help him. Maybe Farhan could come back. Maybe he could relearn what he had forgotten. Yes, surely he could, because love could do everything. But when she arrived home, she found a commotion on the street. The neighbors were holding back poor Farhan's mother, who was trying to kill herself, and that unfortunate woman, in an act of kindness toward her son who looked at her without being able to move, almost forgetting how to breathe, believed she understood what he was saying without words. "Kill me, Mom. Kill me. Make me stop suffering. Please." The lady took a pillow in her hands, approached her son, and Marta couldn't bear to see Farhan's body, that strong young man she had fallen in love with, reduced to a tiny, lifeless body, showing all the fragility that had invaded him in the last year. She hadn't realized it until seeing him like that, dead. The only thing he left were marks of this fragility to which she knew, deep down, she had condemned him. The next night after the burial, Marta received the visit of a woman in black, Aunt Valentina, who invited her to live with her in the House of the Widows, where she would find other broken women capable of understanding her pain. Marta accepted immediately, full of guilt, thinking that perhaps that was the only thing that could save her now from the hell of regret, giving her life to God. When I finished narrating Marta's story, my cousins listened attentively. They already knew this story, although with some different details. That commonly happened, that among families, the stories would transform. Some omitted details when telling it, and others, on the contrary, embellished the memories in a literary way. Let's be honest, no one wanted to separate from the others. The house felt different. I don't know how to describe it, but it didn't feel empty. We looked toward the stairs to the second floor and felt that at any moment someone would come down them, that at any moment you would hear footsteps slowly approaching to ask us what the hell we were doing there. If Aunt Valentina's ghost woke up at night, I hoped she knew we were her family, that she would have mercy on us. We heard footsteps in the distance upstairs, or maybe from the street, we wanted to think, although we knew it was impossible, that not a single sound reached us. After the footsteps, we heard something, an incessant sound. I couldn't identify it. I wasn't even sure if it was real or if I was simply imagining it, if my brain was just playing evil tricks on me. "Do you know the last part of that story? The fate of Marta?" Mariano asked. Viridiana told him not to tell it, but Mariano insisted, "Look, if you already know it, I want to see if what they told you was the same. And if he's going to stay here with us, he also has the right to know. The complete story, right?" he asked, looking at me. With a shrug, I replied that I didn't care, but Mariano continued, "I suppose that of all the widows, Marta has the saddest story. She didn't find any kind of peace here. On the contrary, these walls, this confinement, ended up driving her crazy. It drove her crazy with loneliness, even though she was accompanied by other widows. It drove her crazy with remorse. In her desperation, Marta tore out her hair, scratched her face hard, cutting herself. She destroyed her skin until there was no return. And her monstrous appearance, perhaps losing her hair, her eyebrows, the shape of her nose, her features, made her live a confinement within a confinement because she no longer left her room." "Which room was it? Where was she?" I asked. "Obviously, I don't know that. I don't think anyone really knows. Of course, it wasn't the main one, Aunt Valentina's, but of all the others, God knows who inhabited them for years. Marta could no longer stand to see herself, couldn't stand the light. Only Aunt Valentina could enter to bring her food and collect her dishes. She hid under her bed and scratched the bed from underneath, desperate, knowing that this was her destiny forever, hoping to die as soon as possible, but knowing she didn't deserve that rest. She went to the bathroom only at dawn, when the other widows were sleeping. Only then did she dare to do it, running so that no one would see her completely covered. Someone once told us in their version of this story that Marta was pursued by whatever she asked for in the love spell. A demon or something like that, who knows? But I don't believe it, you know? I think guilt pursued her forever, and that can be even worse than hell. Maybe that was hell, or is. I don't know." We didn't feel like talking anymore. We were scared. At this point, I think we all preferred to go sleep at our houses or on a bench in the park. Anything rather than stay there. The cold we felt in the living room was horrible, worse than being outside. We knew that upstairs that didn't happen, and at that moment we felt that the most sensible thing was to go up, sleep in one of the intact rooms. Maybe there was a reason it was cold down there. We didn't recall all the stories where cold indicated the presence of an evil manifestation, and to avoid risking it, we took our things and hurried upstairs. In doing so, almost reflexively, we entered without hesitation the third room on the left. We don't know why to this day. All the rooms were unlocked, all open, but we chose that one without stopping, without doubting, as if it had been a decision we unconsciously made together. And now, in retrospect, I think that was the first sign that we shouldn't have entered that room. There were 2 beds, one of them against the wall. As soon as I saw it, I immediately claimed that corner, and I felt Mariano lying down next to me. Viridiana settled on the other bed, a large one in the center of the room. It was obvious that it was the only original bed. Since we had gone upstairs very sleepy, it didn't take more than a few minutes for us to fall asleep. But something wouldn't let me sleep. Something woke me up. A sound, this time inside the room. I didn't want to say anything, but the sound was incessant, continuous. Pretending I was turning over in my sleep, I turned toward Mariano. He was sleeping deeply, snoring, his back to me. He had fallen asleep facing the center of the room, where Viridiana was, from where the sound was coming. I subtly lifted my head to look over there, over Mariano. "Are you awake?" whispered Viridiana. "Yes," I replied in the same tone. "There's something under my bed," she said. I felt as if a bucket of cold water ran down my back. I didn't know what to do. I had to sit up more to be able to see under the bed, but I didn't dare. And the sound continued. Viridiana was frozen. I heard that she was crying. I saw her hands in front of her in the position where she was sitting upright. It was clear that she wasn't making the sound. She wasn't even moving. I woke Mariano by patting him on the back. Mariano, Mariano, do you hear that? Viridiana says there's something under her bed. Mariano asked me what was happening, confused, as he tried to open his eyes and sit up. He turned on the lamp beside him, and then his scream, the most terrifying scream I remember in my life. Mariano jumped from his bed in one movement and ran out, tripping over the lamp cord, which left us in darkness again. Viridiana ran after him, and I jumped into the darkness without knowing where to go, bumping into walls, into things, until I reached the door. I ran downstairs after them. We went out to the courtyard, opened the heavy door, and didn't stop running down the street until we reached the park. And we woke up on a bench. I remember it well. Only in the morning did we dare to return to the house of the widows for our things. That's when Viridiana recounted that something had woken her up the night before. We hadn't wanted to touch the topic. She said it was the same thing I heard, that something was scratching under her bed, what I had been hearing all night but stupidly hadn't dared to mention. We asked Mariano what he had seen, why he had run out screaming, but he didn't dare tell us. Weeks passed until he finally did. He said that when we woke him up, he opened his eyes and felt that he saw something in the darkness under the bed in front of him, under where Viridiana was. That's why he turned on the lamp, confused. And he saw her under the bed. He saw a woman without hair, without eyebrows, without features, with long, thin hands with a smile full of blood scratching the underside of the bed. The thing is, what we experienced is by far not one of the worst stories from the House of the Widows. There are others that are much scarier still, like what my Uncle Lalo saw. My dream is that eventually Uriel can get to know the house. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my story. Good night.